Hello and welcome to Olevels Virtual School. This is your IGCSE Biology 0610 and I am Dr. Hamna. I will be your teacher. So today we will be covering chapter 1 of IGCSE Biology, which is the characteristics and classification of living things. It's important to note that we might not cover the full chapter in full detail, but this video will surely be helpful to have a quick rundown of all the topics. So without further ado, let's get to the topics. First, we have to learn about the characteristics of living things. So all of the living things have been given some general characteristics that we can identify. These are these 7 characteristics, and these have been promptly or aptly given the mnemonic of Mrs. Gren. So MRS is Mrs. and GREN is Mrs. Gren. It's for the Gren and Mrs. Gren. M is for movement. It is an action by an organism or part of the organism causing the change in position or place. So movement is an action causing change in position. Respiration is the chemical reactions in the cells which break down nutrient and release energy. So respiration are the chemical reactions in the cell that break down the nutrients to release energy. Sensitivity is the ability to detect stimuli in the environment and to make the appropriate responses. It's the ability to detect or sense stimuli in the external environment and to make appropriate responses. Growth, it's the permanent increase in size or dry mass by an increase in the cell number or cell size. So it's the permanent increase in the size by an increase in cell number or cell size. Reproduction. So reproduction is a biological process of producing new organisms which are offsprings from their parents. Excretion. Excretion is the removal of organisms of the waste products. So it's the removal of waste products of metabolism, the toxic materials, and the substances that are in excess that we don't require in our body. Nutrition. Nutrition is the taking in of materials, and we need that material for energy, for growth, for development. So plants and animals both require nutrients. So plants require light, carbon dioxide, water, and ions, and animals need organic compounds and ions and waters as well. So this was the characteristics of living organisms. Moving on to the classification of living things. So the living things have been classified in many ways. So generally they have been classified according to the Linus classification. Linus was the scientist who gave this classification, and they have been classified from being very generalized to become very specific. So this classification includes kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So it's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Kingdom is very broad. It contains a lot. It contains the whole kingdom, and phylum, class, order. These are specifying the further classification, further characteristics, and coming right down to genus and species. Linus classification system Linus also gave the binomial naming system, and the binomial naming system consists of the genus and the species part. The genus and species are in the binomial naming of this. It gives the scientific name to every organism. So genus, it would be the first letter of genus would be capitalized, and species would always be in lowercase, and together they would form the binomial scientific name. Another way of classifying organisms is how they get energy or how they consume food. This is the energy pyramid. So organisms that produce their own food are the producers. They make their own food and then they eat that food by themselves or give it to others as well. Primary consumers are the animals or the organisms that take the food that is made by the producers. So primary consumers consume the producers. Secondary consumers are the organisms that would consume the primary consumers. So these organisms, the secondary consumers, would consume the organism that would be eating the producers. And tertiary consumers are the organisms that would consuming the secondary consumers. There's to differentiate between if an animal is or organism is a tertiary or secondary consumer, you just have to think about what it's eating. If a snake is eating a rabbit, if we know that this rabbit is a primary consumer, so automatically the snake would be a secondary consumer. And if we know that an eagle is eating a snake, so we just have to figure out what kind of a consumer the snake is. If the snake is a secondary consumer, then automatically the thing or organism that's eating the snake would lie in the tertiary consumer part, the tertiary consumer level. Coming to the kingdoms of living things. So there are 5 kingdoms of living things. So the major ones, as we can see from this diagram, is the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom, which is very well known. These mushrooms are in the fungi kingdom. And then we have these microorganisms. This one is the bacteria. So this is the prokaryotes kingdom. And in this one, these are the amoeba. This one is the Protoctus kingdom. Here in this chart contains the general characteristics and some examples of all of the 5 kingdoms. So animal, plants, fungi are the 3 major and the 3 easiest ones. So to remember the characteristics, animal, plants, fungi, and Protoctus, these four kingdoms all have multicellular organisms. All these organisms are multicellular, meaning they have multiple cells. Only prokaryotes are unicellular. Now, animals cells have nucleus, but they don't have a cell wall. And if they don't have cell wall, they don't have cellulose as well in their cell wall. And they don't have chloroplast either. And they feed on organic substances. Plants are opposite. Plant cells also have nucleus, but they have cell walls, which are made of cellulose, and they also contain chloroplast, which contains chlorophyll and gives the plants the green color. We know that plants feed by photosynthesis, and animals undergo respiration, not photosynthesis. Plants have roots, stems, and leaves, while animals have other limbs and some animals have wings, some animals come in different other features. Fungi are usually multicellular. They have nuclei with cell walls not made of cellulose. So fungi have cell walls like plants, but these cell walls are not made of cellulose, and they don't have chlorophylls. When we think of fungi, just think of a mushroom. So if you think of a mushroom, you know that mushrooms aren't usually green. But they are somehow plants, right? We think of mushroom, they grow in the soil, so we think of them as plants, but they're not plants. So they have cell walls, not made of cellulose, and don't have chlorophyll because they're not green. And we know that there are certain poisonous mushrooms as well. So these mushrooms or fungi usually have parasitic nutrition, because if you think of a poisonous mushroom, think that it is undergoing parasitic nutrition. So Protoctus. So it's very confusing, these 2 kingdoms, right? Protoctus and prokaryotes. So to remember Protoctus, just have this little detail known. Protoctus has 1 T and 2 T's. So Protoctus has 2 T's. And what other thing has T's? Plants. Plants have T's. So if you think Protoctus, know that it's closer to plants than it is to other things. So if you think of Protoctus, think that it has animal features and plant features, both of these. So Protoctus, it could be multicellular or unicellular. These cells have nucleus, and they may or may not have cell walls or chloroplasts, and some feed by photosynthesis and others feed by organic substances. So the cell wall and chloroplast and photosynthesis, these are the plant features that Protoctus may have, and it may not have these features as well. It may have animal features like feeding on organic substances and being multicellular. So Protoctus are the kingdom that has both animal and plant features. Coming to prokaryotes, prokaryotes is pro meaning before and karyotes meaning having nucleus. So if you just remember, pro meaning before and karyotes nucleus, it's before nucleus. So before nucleus, so that means they have no nucleus, or they have the genetic materials that is in the nucleus, but they don't have a true nucleus. So they don't have a nucleus They don't have cell walls or cellulose, and they have no mitochondria. So they just have genetic material lying about in the cell. So they're unicellular and they have no nucleus and no mitochondria. These examples would include E. coli and bacteria. And prototists are amoeba, paramecium, and chlamydomonas. Fungi, as I said before, mushrooms, or the bread mold. If you see the moldy bread we get when it's been lying around in the kitchen for a few days, that is a fungi. And plants, we already know that there are so many plants, and animals as well. We have lions, tigers, earthworm, centipede, all of these animals. Here, further going in the animal kingdom has a lot other phylums. So we studied in the Linus classification kingdom phylum class. So we studied kingdom is the animal kingdom. So further classified in the animal kingdom are the phylums. We have different phylums, but today we will be only going through phylum arthropods and phylum vertebrates. Phylum arthropods has insects and other worms in it, and phylum vertebrates have fish, reptiles, birds, amphibians, and mammals. Firstly, phylum vertebrates. Phylum vertebrates, as I told before, are mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, amphibians. And here are the general characteristics of these vertebrates and some examples. So mammals being the easiest one, mammals have hair and they have mammary glands which produce milk. They have a placenta, have a diaphragm, and they have teeth. These ICPM are the teeth, the incisors, the canines, the premolars, and molars. And mammals have heart with 4 chambers and they're endothermic, meaning they're warm-blooded. Birds, the general features of the birds are also very common. They have feathers, they have wings as forelimbs, they have a beak, they lay eggs with hard shells, and their heart also has 4 chambers and they're also warm-blooded or endothermic. Reptiles, now this is different. Reptiles are vertebrates with scaly skins. If you think of a reptile, think of like a snake or an alligator. Those are reptiles, and they have scaly skin. They lay eggs with the rubbery shells. So birds laid eggs with hard shells. Reptiles lay egg with rubbery shells. Coming to fish. Fish are vertebrates with scaly skin. Again, we know the fish have scaly skins that we usually descale a fish when we eat it. They have gills, so they can breathe underwater, and they also have fins, so they can swim underwater. Amphibians. Now, amphibians are the vertebrates, are the animals that live in both water and on land. So these are vertebrates with moist, scaleless skin. So reptiles and fish had scaly skin. Amphibians had scaleless and moist skin. Think of a frog. The skin of a frog is very slimy, right? And it's scaleless. And they lay eggs in water. Again, think of a frog. Frog lays egg in the water and those become tadpoles. You don't see a tadpole on land, do you? And adults often live on land, and the larva has gills and the adult has lungs. So thinking of a frog larva, which are tadpoles, has gills so it can swim. And when it grows up, they develop lungs so it can go on land as well. Here are some pictures of mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, and amphibians. Coming to the phylum arthropods. Now, arthropods are the animals that have, see, when we went through animal kingdom in the vertebrates, the general features of all vertebrates is that they all have a vertebra or a backbone that is inside their body. They have an endoskeleton, right? But in arthropods, they have the skeleton outside their body, meaning they have an exoskeleton. So in this one, it includes insects, crustaceans, arachnids, and myriapods. Insects are the most common. Arthropods generally translates to having jointed limbs. So these are the creatures that have jointed limbs, or they have limbs that have multiple joints. So arthropods have insects. Insects are the arthropods with 3 pairs of jointed limbs or jointed legs. They have 2 pairs of wings. They have a trachea, and their body is divided into head, thorax, abdomen, like 3 parts. So remembering insects is easy. Insects have 3 pairs of jointed legs and body is divided into 3 parts. Three pairs jointed legs, 3 parts divided, body divided into 3 parts. Head, thorax, abdomen. And the examples include locusts and moths. Crustaceans, remember this CR, it is the crustaceans. Think of a crab, the CR for a crab. So when you think of a crab, crab has more than 4 pairs of jointed legs. They breathe through gills because crabs can go underwater as well, and they're not millipedes or centipedes. Arachnids, when you think of arachnids, think of a spider. And when you think of a spider, you know the spider has 4 pairs of jointed legs because we know spiders have 8 legs, so meaning 4 pairs. And spiders have 2 body parts. Insects have 3 body parts, spiders have 2 body parts. Now myriapods. Myriapods, see this M? This M indicates the example of millipedes. And when they're millipedes, they're also centipedes, they're in the same class. So myriapods have bodies that have many segments, and each segment has their own jointed limbs. So when you think of a centipede has many segments inside it, and each segment has its own jointed limbs. Here are some example the pictures. So locusts and moth are the insects, and they have 3 body parts: head, thorax, and abdomen, and they have wings, and they have jointed three. They have 3 pairs of jointed limbs as well. This is the first pair, this is the second one, and this is the third one. And the crabs are the crustaceans. They have more than 4 pairs of jointed limbs, and they have gills because they live underwater as well. Spiders have 4 pairs of jointed limbs. Because they have 8 limbs. 1, 2, 3, 4. And their body is divided into 2 parts. See, this one part and this is the second part. Centipede having many segments. See each segment. This is a segment, this is another segment, and this is another one, this is another one. And each segment has its own pair of limbs. Jointed legs on each segment. Now coming to plants. Now plants are divided into 2 major parts. So they're either flowering plants or non-flowering plants. So non-flowering plants are referred as ferns. Now these plants have roots, stems, and leaves, but they don't have flowers. Their leaves are called fronds. The ferns, because it starts with an F, I think they have no flowers, and their leaves are called fronds. They don't produce flowers, and because they don't have flowers, they reproduce by spores. Their leaves are called fronds because these leaves have spores in them. Now, flowering plants have roots, stems, leaves, and flowers and they reproduce sexually by means of flowers and seeds. And their seeds are produced inside the ovary of the flower, and they could be monocotyledon and dicotyledonous. So monocots and dicots. We'll go further into that. Now, monocotyledons or dicotyledons are divided by the number of cotyledons they have. Mono means one, and cotyledon is a cotyledon. The cotyledon is the part in the seed where the first leaf comes from. So you see the seed when it's planted underground, you know how the first leaf comes out of this seed? That part is the cotyledon. So monocotyledons are the flowering plants with seeds having one cotyledon. Dicotyledonous plants are the flowering plants with seeds having 2 cotyledons. Monocotyledons have branching roots. See this root? It keeps on branching and gives more branches and it gives more branches. These have branching roots. Dicotyledonous plants have tap roots. So it has one major root going underground and tiny root hairs coming out of this one big root. This is called tap roots. Monocotyledons have narrow leaves and they have parallel veins. So see this is a very narrow leaf with parallel running veins inside it. Monocotyledons have narrow leaves with parallel veins, and dicotyledons have oval leaves with branching veins or net-like veins. So the veins and roots are opposite. So monocot, if you remember that monocot have branching roots, they don't have branching veins. And dicot have tap roots and they have branching veins. So this is opposite. Now, if you remember one, you can remember the other. It's easier. Now, monocotyledons have flowers in petals with multiples of 3. So they have 3 petals and then they have 3 petals in downward and then they have 3 petals coming up. If they have more petals, there will also be 3. It could be 3, 6, 9. It's multiples of 3. Dicotyledonous flowers have petals with flowers with 4 or 5 petals. So they could have 5 or 4 petals like this. They're all arranged in one circle. Here are some examples. This is fern. These ferns have leaves that are called fronds because they have spores on them and they reproduce by these spores, and they have roots like this. And corn and pea are the flowering plants. Corns are monocots and pea is a dicotyledonous plant. See, these are narrow leaves with parallel veins, and these have bigger leaves with branching veins. All right, coming to viruses. Here are some general characteristics of viruses. Viruses are included in living organisms, but they're also included in non-living organisms. And why is that? Because they are not alive until they're inside a living cell. So viruses on their own are not alive. But when they get inside a body of a living organism, they become living. And then what do they do inside a body or a living cell? They take over the host cell and then they multiply. And when they multiply, they become so many in number that they burst out of that cell, or the cell bursts, the host cell bursts. And when they burst, these other viruses that are out, they invade other cells, and those cells burst as well. And if this continues, the host is usually killed. But on their own, like without being inside a cell, viruses cannot move or feed or excrete or show sensitivity, grow or reproduce. See these characteristics? These are the Mrs. Gren characteristics, right? The movement, the nutrition, excretion, sensitivity, growth, reproduction. Viruses are not living on their own, so they cannot undergo the Mrs. Gren characteristics. The structure of a virus has a simple DNA or an RNA surrounded by a protein coat. Here is the diagram. This is the simplest diagram of a virus. The inside structure is the genetic material for RNA or DNA, and outside is the protein coat. If you're asked the two characteristics of a virus, it's the protein coat and the genetic material. Since we've covered all of the topics, I've included some key definitions. You can pause and screenshot this. These are first the Mrs. Gren definitions, and then we have species. Definition of species: it's a group of organisms that can reproduce and produce fertile offsprings. Binomial system, or the binomial naming system, is the internationally agreed system in which the scientific name of an organism is made up of 2 parts, the 2 parts being the genus and the species. DNA. DNA is the chemical form which chromosomes are made, from which chromosomes are made. DNA, you can also write it's the deoxyribonucleic acid inside the chromosomes, inside the nucleus. And reproduction is also part of the Mrs. Gren characteristics. This was all about chapter 1. Thank you for listening, and we will be continuing chapter 2 in the next video.